Happy New Year, everyone. This is the January 3rd, 2022 edition of Lunch with Lincoln. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a healthy, happy holiday, Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's season. I am Reed Galen, your host for today, co-founder of the Lincoln Project. It is 9 o'clock in the West and noon in the East. My guest today is Arieh Kovler. He is joining us live from Jerusalem. Arieh, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Arieh, as you know, we're coming up just days away from the anniversary of the January 6th attack and insurrection on the United States Capitol. Going back to December 21st of 2020, and I think we can put up Arieh's tweet, you basically said, on January 6th, armed Trumpist militias will be rallying in D.C. at Trump's orders. It's highly likely that they'll try to storm the Capitol after it certifies Joe Biden's win. I don't think this is sunk in yet. Arieh, I got to be honest with you. I think a year on, I still don't think it's sunk in.
No, I mean, for me either, really. Why did I write, I don't think it's sunk in yet? Because it seemed to me like the country wasn't preparing for the trauma. And I think that, the events in the weeks, months, and in the year since have kind of shown that to be true.
Well, I think they have, and it's this weird thing as you and I were talking right before we went live, there's this sort of downward pressure on everyone's mood based on just COVID, right? Like we're in a pandemic. We're close to 2 years on that, at least here in the United States.
Yep.
And so there's that sort of bubbling tension. But when it comes to American democracy and what we saw a year ago, there still seems to be a lot of sleepwalking, not only on the part of a lot of American political leaders, but on the part of Americans writ large too.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. It seemed like everyone took January 6th really seriously for about a month, 6 weeks maybe. And then everyone really on all sides, I think, has kind of, oh, well, I guess that was then and everything's okay now. Joe Biden's president, Trump's out of office, everything's fine. When in fact, the forces set loose, I don't think it's fair to say set loose that day. The forces set loose that led to that day are still out there.
Right. No, I mean, that's something, we started saying in May of 2020 that the 2020 election wouldn't be over on November 3rd. In fact, it wouldn't be over until Joe Biden took the oath of office on January 20th. That entire summer, we had phone calls with different groups. We did tabletop exercises about whether or not Trump would do something post November 3rd if he lost. We wrote a collective op-ed as the Lincoln Project, basically saying, he's not going to go quietly into that good night. It's now up to Republicans, especially those within the power centers of Washington, D.C., to decide whether or not they'll cross the river with him. And they did. You think back, now more than a year ago, that so many of those Republicans, what we would otherwise have called establishment Republicans, wouldn't say whether or not Joe Biden was, elected, whether or not it was a free and fair election. Fast forward 370 some days, 53, 54 weeks. Now that's the party line. It's not just like that, was something that Republicans said they were afraid of talking about because there were U.S. Senate races going on in Georgia. It is now mainstream Republican thought. In fact, 68% of Republicans in a November survey now believe that they think that Joe Biden stole the election.
Yeah. And can a Republican candidate win a primary saying that Joe Biden won the election? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure some will, but the vast majority, there's going to be a question, right? And everyone's going to have to genuflect and try and prove they have the craziest theory. I think, I come from a country here in Israel where we do have primaries in some parties. And I'm not a fan in the whole of that being a way to choose candidates because it leads to increasing polarization. I think the next round of primaries is going to lead to an even crazier group of people because what are the questions that are going to be the shibboleths? It's going to be vaccines. It's going to be elections. It's going to be did Trump really win? And did Joe Biden steal the election? And those are going to be the questions. the Republicans are going to have to answer to pass the purity test and to be the candidates.
Well, and yeah, I mean, that's the other part too, which is if 68% of Republicans surveyed, right, and who knows if you surveyed all, however, tens of millions of people who registered as Republicans, whether or not, do they believe they live in an occupied country? They very well might at this point, right? They very well might believe that between the election being stolen, as you said, whether and COVID and vaccines, whether or not they're taking all of their other sort of revanchist and resentment and applying it to these things as they see that's quote unquote going after their freedom and their liberty, when in fact, like, you get sick and you're not vaccinated, you're likely going to get sick, really sick, and maybe die from this thing. But reality's out the window, I guess, and that's the other part that you and I spoke about briefly, which is why is it so hard, talking about this, waking up piece of this. Why is it so hard for folks to understand that what we're seeing here is not based in rationality, right? You can't explain it away with facts and figures because it's based in belief, not in facts.
Yeah, and like it's a very difficult thing to understand because, of course, once people are in that mindset, then, and I was talking to somebody recently actually who was kind of at least softly in this kind of in the world of, well, the election maybe was stolen and maybe vaccines don't. One of those kind of people who they won't come out and say it outright, but they want to play with it. Yeah. And who was it? Sartre, who wrote that when talking particularly about anti-Semitism in his famous book, that the anti-Semite has the right to play because and you see this across, I think, various forms of right-wing extremism. Being willing to, I said this. I'm not saying it's true, but it's an interesting theory, and we should think about it and talk about it now. There's people like that. There's a lot of them out there. I was saying, well, this what you're saying isn't true. That didn't happen that way, and the news said this, and the people in the party opposed it, or whatever. Well, you believe that report, you believe the news, you believe that. So you can't argue with people who just won't accept the basic facts because all facts are biased and everything that you read is part of the conspiracy, and what they saw on Facebook or what they heard from whatever crazy podcast they're listening to. I completely somewhat unconnected. I don't want to keep harping on about COVID stuff, right? But I was just listening before I came on to Charlie Kirk's podcast, right? And he had Zelenko on a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, I don't know why. And you get these guys on, and Zelenko suddenly starts going on about how the vaccines are all microchips, and they're sending your data to Microsoft through some kind of magical thing. And also, it's the mark of the beast from the Book of Revelation, which is a weird thing because Zelenko is an ultra-Orthodox Jew and he's quoting the New Testament. And they just kind of, a lot of people listen to that and they're like, oh, well, this guy said it. And why did I listen to it? Because I was just reading one of the most hardcore Trump MAGA forums, the Donalds. And suddenly everyone's saying, oh, the vaccine has a microchip. And people say, hang on, didn't we discredit that? Didn't we just think that was a bit too crazy even for us? He said, oh, but Dr. Zelenko said it. He said it to Charlie Kirk. It must be true. He's a doctor. Right. So, if you're in this world, you're just seeing such a different picture, right? A world where like the most, where even Fox News is in the bag, right? Even they're part of the conspiracy. And really the only real true news out there is people who are banned from Twitter always, you can't really believe them. So it's just such a different world, a different reality these people are living in to the rest of us.
Well, and let me bring up Fox for a second, because I have friends and former colleagues who currently work for Fox News. These were normal people, right? When I met them, when we worked in mainstream Republican politics, such as it was, 15 years ago. They're either complicit on the best day or they're responsible on the worst. And it's just one of those things, Arieh, that sort of boggles the mind. Like, they go to work every day. That stuff is on every television in the place, right? Yeah. They're deciding on what it is they're going to talk about, what the headlines are going to be, what craziness they're going to come up with. And I think to myself, like, you were like a good guy. You were a normal human being. And now it's like you sit there and you contribute to spewing this stuff out into the ether. And let me ask you this. As someone who is a literal and virtual observer of American politics, as you sit in the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, what does it look like to you all? Not only from the right-wing media machine, which it seems to me, I think drives the political narrative in this country.
Yeah.
I think it does, and everything else reacts to it. But also just, as you see this stuff, what does it look like from, a longstanding ally of the United States that, we're now in this position? What does that say to the rest of the world? What does it say to you?
Look, I don't know why I have an odd emotional attachment to America and to American democracy. I didn't visit America until I was a teenager. I ended up marrying an American, and I don't know. There's something very sad about it all. Have we witnessed the last democratic election in American history, or the penultimate democratic election in American history? Like, we really might have done, and that's a big deal, right? I don't know how widely it's sunk in the general global public. Not everyone's watching things as closely in America.
Right.
But I do think that the kind of Cold War and immediate post-Cold War era where the US, it kind of was held up as a bit of a role model, as something to imitate, as something to be.
Right.
And now we've seen, in a lot of places, those countries that did choose to try and go the American model of a strong presidency, of many of them have kind of fallen as democracies. It's very hard to maintain a presidential system, a pure presidential system, keep it democratic. And America was they managed it. Maybe other people can too. And now we've seen what a president can do if he doesn't give a shit about democracy, and the people around him and his party don't give a shit about democracy. And I don't know what the way back is. Something that's been bothering me in the back of my head is that the Republicans can absolutely win in 2024.
Oh,
absolutely
for sure.
win.
Absolutely. And anybody who doesn't believe that,
yeah.
I've got a bridge in Arizona to sell them.
Sure.
So.
And I think Trump would be a bad candidate. I think there are a lot better candidates for the Republican Party to run than Donald Trump.
I think absolutely there are.
But Trump could win too, right? And if he does, a lot of people who are against the Republican Party, Democrats or otherwise, are going to think that the election was stolen because the Republicans are setting up an infrastructure to steal elections, whether or not it was. And if whoever the Republican is loses, a lot of people in the Republican Party are going to say that the election was stolen. So whoever wins in 2024, a good proportion of the country is going to walk away thinking that the election was stolen from them by them, whoever they are.
Right.
And that's a real problem, a real dangerous recipe for stability going forward.
Well, that's as Stuart Stevens, one of our senior advisors, once said when he was doing a campaign, I think in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He was an observer there, and one of his hosts said, you guys seem to forget that in a democracy somebody has to be willing to lose. And if no one's willing to lose, or one side isn't willing to lose, and have now, especially for Republicans, espoused a sort of almost blood and soil sort of ethos that is mixed with a great deal of violence, either actual, implied, threatened, whatever the case might be. It doesn't take that many people, that many scary guys in Hawaiian shirts with AR-15s rolling around suburbs to keep people in their houses.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. Look, one of the things that I was worried about going into 2020 that we mostly didn't see, actually, even in red states or red districts and blue states or whatever, was that, right? We didn't really see that kind of on the ground, on the day election intimidation that I think a lot of people worried about might happen. But I don't have any confidence that we won't see it next time, especially now that the election infrastructure is kind of in the frame, rather than being the neutral arbiter. Democrats and the Republicans, and you go into the vote and you pull the handle, however it is Americans vote, or they push the button, and the Democrats and the Republicans outside can argue about who to vote for. Now one side is going to be coming in angry at the handle, right? One side is going to be coming in thinking that the room that they're voting in is the enemy, And that really changes the calculus of just the mechanics of elections on election day. Like, how do you secure, how do you secure polling places when one side thinks the polling place is the enemy?
Well, and I would say this too, is that, there's the election day piece, right? Which is, there are a lot of these laws that have passed in the states, have basically said, that the election observer, whoever that person might be, has darn well free reign to do whatever it is they want. And if you're an elections judge or a poll worker and you quote unquote interfere with them, you as the elections worker could be held criminally liable, which just opens the door wide to a bunch of people willing to come in and sort of, harass people standing in line. I would also say that because, we do elections, generally speaking, by county and then down to the precinct level, you could have a situation in which you have a very conservative county, or even maybe let's say a split county with a very conservative, let's say, sheriff, right? Who determines that, he's going to have a couple of deputies roll into a polling place and, cart off a couple of boxes in the back of their cruiser. And now you've got all sorts of issues. Whose votes are gone? What's the chain of custody?
Yeah. We need to take them for auditing because we heard there was fraud.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. We need to take these. We need to protect these. Well, can we have them back? No, we're not sure about you yet. And that sort of leads into, that doubles down on the willingness of both sides to believe that it's a free and fair election, because at that point it won't be. And now you get into the post-election machinations, where in a lot of these places, conservative legislatures have empowered themselves, to appoint these boards and individuals to decide whether or not a voter is eligible, whether or not to decide a ballot is null and void, and just all of this stuff that not only, puts the weight on the scale for one side as opposed to the other, but also, again, further reduces the belief that anybody has that the system works, which will have a actual corresponding electoral effect, which is people won't show up, whether or not it's because they're intimidated or it could be, look, too many Americans already believe their vote don't matter, right? It doesn't matter. So like, we already have that issue.
Well, a lot of them are right. But yes.
And so, how do you see this going from here? So now, Thursday, it'll be a year from January 6th. No one has been held accountable except for the people who've stormed the Capitol, right? There's now it's a tired trope, but true nonetheless, which is, a coup unprosecuted is just a practice run. So take us through your belief, from January 6th, 2022 until, election day of this year in November here in the US.
I don't think we see another Capitol siege in the way that we saw it before, because I don't think you need to. January the 6th happened this year for a bunch of unique factors. One of which, like you don't get January the 6th in the way that you get it if the people who were coming there didn't think that Trump was going to win that day. Mm-hmm. They didn't come to argue and protest. They came to celebrate. And then when the Pence letter came out and they realized it wasn't going to happen, they freaked the fuck out. Excuse my language. And they and things, took the shape that they did. Obviously, they're a bit more complicated than that. But in its broader sense, January 6th was the people there having a collective meltdown as they realized that 6 months of being told that Trump was winning, Trump was definitely going to win. Trump has won, he just didn't know it. But more than that, he had a plan, and the plan was going to be great. And any day now, he was going to be returned. Was just a big lie, and they'd be lied to. And then, when Trump did eventually hours later come on and tell them, oh, by the way, go home. I never had a plan. This whole thing is ridiculous, and you'll probably go to jail now. Ha, right? I could pardon you, but I'm not. Right? Then a lot of them wartime disillusioned. I mean, obviously, people have told themselves new stories, have managed to lie to themselves again about what they were doing and why they were doing it that day. People who were there saying that they weren't, who genuinely believe it was Antifa.
Right.
They were there.
Or was the CIA, special forces or something, yeah.
Yeah, but we were psyoped by whatever, yeah? I think, look, and Trump's refusal to move on in 2020 is actually in some ways kind of helpful here, in that it makes it harder for maybe some of the worst people to look forward. when they're being constantly dragged back. You know,
Right.
Trump is not always helpful to the worst people around him because he's a moron, you know. So like,
not only that. I mean, it's all dependent on what he thinks is best for him.
yeah.
And so whatever's best for him will always come first. And if that means that he's got to cut somebody loose, you know, he doesn't care.
Sure. Right? And what's best for him is often kind of intangible, you know. It's about his feels. You know, the guy's a head case that we could write a book on, and many people will have. But like, I do think so. Here's a few things that I think. I think that heading into 2024, the issue of pardons for the January 6th rioters is going to be a live issue in the Republican primary, if there is a Republican primary. I think if Trump says he's going to run, I'm not sure there'll be a Republican primary.
Oh, there won't be.
No. Yeah. And there were a lot of, even though there'll probably be some quite big figures in the party who would want the opportunity to maybe test their mettle against him, I don't think they will get that opportunity, or they won't get it in enough states to be viable. You know,
right?
How many states need to cancel their primary before it doesn't work? I mean, probably not so many. And then, you know, it's already, do you really want to compete where you're only 30 states up? I don't know. Right. I think 2022, it's pretty clear which way the House is going. And I think we'll see an incredible number of wacky investigations. It's kind of weird, actually, that like there's nothing being set up. Notice this. There's sort of nothing being set up to investigate, right? From the last year of Biden, right? There's no like Biden issue that the Republicans are like, when we take the House, we're going to hold hearings on Biden's, right? So presumably they'll be trying to relitigate the 2020 election through House hearings in 2022.
Well, so if there's one thing I can say about the modern Republican Party is never underestimate their imagination when it comes to things. That they will come up with stuff. There are people working hard right now, probably not in the halls of Congress, but probably someplace at like Heritage Action or the Claremont Institute or someplace like that to come up with the craziest shit they can find. I truly believe this too, is that, you know, maybe they'll do investigations. My guess is that they'll start with Vice President Kamala Harris. I think
you may well be right, but yeah. I suspect that actually, no, I think you're wrong. Actually, I think the first thing that their base will demand they investigate is Anthony Fauci.
Oh, sure. I think you're probably right.
And you know, like NIH and basically all things COVID. And that's kind of the only real recurring issue right now that you see in kind of MAGA spaces. Everything is COVID, 2020 elections. So I think, you know, we'll end up seeing the 2020 election relitigated through probably interminable hearings, which I can't imagine will play well politically, because the country doesn't want to do 2020 election Benghazi style, right? When most people don't think there's anything to investigate. I expect they'll find something to investigate Hillary Clinton for, because that's good.
But I mean, we should. But again, we shouldn't be victims of our own lack of imagination either. Which is, just because the country may want to move on from 2020 doesn't mean that is not a desire of whoever ends up being speaker. I don't think it'll be Kevin McCarthy, to be honest with you. No. So it will be someone far closer to sort of the Trump orbit.
Oh, absolutely. Look. The most of the current House GOP caucus voted to overturn the election.
Right.
And the 2022 House GOP caucus is not going to be more sensible or more moderate than the current one. Right? For sure. I was thinking, how big do the Republicans have to win before the Make Trump Speaker plan becomes viable?
Not that much. Not that big.
Right. Not that big. You know, because you're going to have a handful of Republicans, you know, even some of the ones who are keeping quiet now, who are like, no, this is batshit insane. But you know, how are they going to have the balls to stand up and say that? Like, you know, are they going to make it happen? So, like, I don't think Trump's going to become speaker, but I do think it's going to be live, because they're going to be the Matt Gaetzes who are going to be pushing it.
They'll put his name. Look, if they take the House, Gaetz and at least a couple of others will put his name into nomination. I wouldn't be surprised if a guy like Jim Jordan actually led the charge on that. And then Donald Trump said, Jim, I appreciate it, but you're my guy. Yeah. You're my guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Jim Jordan's a pretty good good guess. I agree for the speakership. And then I just think we have 2 years of bedlam and chaos. Whether or not Trump is the candidate or whether it's DeSantis or whatever, there's a bunch of people who have obviously zero hope of the media kind of like. But
right.
Like, it's really going to be 2 or 3 people, right? It's not going to be if it's Trump, then the game all becomes all these people basically playing the apprentice to be the VP.
Right. Well, yeah, and I mean that's the thing is we know. I mean, there was a little bit of a blurb out this morning that Trump, the Republican chairman in Florida, goes to Mar-a-Lago all the time and just bashes DeSantis to Trump just to get him fired up, right? Just to get him angry because he doesn't like DeSantis. They're from the same state, so under our rules, you can't run as a ticket, and Trump wouldn't have somebody like that anyway. He needs somebody far more obsequious, like a Mike Pence, to do that. So let me ask you this. So tell us a little bit about your Substack. It's called The Hat Tip.
It's called The Hat Tip because I'm not wearing one right now, but I am a very white person in a hot country, and I wear a hat for like 8 months a year.
Sure.
It's increasing as it gets hotter over the years. And I write about a variety of issues, US politics, and at the moment I'm in the middle of a bit of a series on January the 6th, actually. I wrote a piece 2 weeks ago that sort of tried to look inside the MAGA mind from 2015-16 until January the 6th and explain how those people got there in their heads. And then last week I actually just published a piece on all the ways that January 6th could have been worse, and there are a lot.
No, I read that this morning, and this is
lucky.
Arieh, that's one of these things too that you just can't. History turns on these moments, right?
Yeah.
Officer Goodman being in that hallway at that moment, right? At that moment, potentially saved dozens, maybe hundreds of lives, right? If he doesn't tell Mitt Romney to turn around and run for his life, if he doesn't make them angry and lead them away from that door, we're in a different ballgame altogether.
Yeah. And, if he'd been posted just somewhere else slightly, right? If he'd had a bad dinner the night before and was in the bathroom, right, then we have a completely different scenario that could have resulted in dead members of Congress, could have resulted in the need to essentially the special forces or the FBI recapturing and rescuing hostages. All sorts of things that nearly, if the bombs had gone off, which remember, we still don't know. Someone planted bombs at the DNC and RNC headquarters. We still don't know who did that. And it doesn't seem like we haven't heard of any progress in that investigation at all. If those bombs had gone off, we'd been in a different place.
Right. And it's always a good reminder.
If one person in the crowd had started shooting, or one police officer had felt the need to rescue their colleague being beaten by shooting at the protesters, I think we would have had a full-scale battle on the streets, and then the military might have ended up being involved with the National Guard, would have perhaps been sent in, and we could have a whole different picture. So, history on January the 6th, in some ways, the result that happened was almost the best available, because this was never going to be a quiet, bloodless protest. Once Trump had called these people there important.
Right. Well, listen, I mean, Arieh, I want to thank you for joining me today. And folks, we're going to roll out a new feature for you here. You've got to listen to me talk for a minute. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Capitol itself. I grew up in the United States Capitol. First, I was the son of a staffer in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. I went there going as far back as I could remember, wandering those halls, not only the Capitol itself, but the House and Senate office buildings. When I was a little older in high school, one summer I got to serve as a page, be on the floor every day and watch the proceedings. And I think now about how, sitting there as a 17-year-old, how I probably took it all for granted. In college, I was an intern across the street. And I went to the speaker's office and I went to the majority leader's office every day. I walked through those halls. And when I saw what happened and was happening on January 6th a year ago, as my dad said, it was almost like a tsunami. At first, you didn't know what was happening. The water was rushing away, and then all of a sudden it started rushing back in. And we saw these people storming the Capitol. We didn't know what was happening, and then all of a sudden we did know what was happening. And it was horrifying. I remember getting a text from a friend of mine in Egypt asking me, "Are you okay?" And I said, I'm not okay. And he said, you shouldn't be. He said, where I come from, we're used to things like this. We don't expect to see stuff like this from the United States. And as I said to Arieh just a minute ago, once violence enters the political lexicon, it's very, very difficult to get rid of it. It's very difficult to root it out because we have a political system. We have a democracy specifically so that every American voter has the choice to make about how they want the country to run and the direction they want it to go. When that stuff starts to come, as Mao said, from the barrel of a gun instead of from a polling place, we have entered an entirely new place in American history. We must not forget that, and we must not take anything else for granted. We have now, gang, about 11 months to decide what's going to happen in the U.S. House, what's going to happen in the United States Senate, and what's going to happen in a lot of these governor's races in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. We must do all we can to ensure that the next time something like this is going to happen, we have prepared for it, that we are allowed to make sure that the United States Capitol remains the citadel of American democracy and a beacon not only to our citizens, but to the world, that here in the United States, the rule of law, one man, one woman, one vote counts, and that we will do all we can to ensure that we have free and fair elections in 2022 and 2024 and beyond. Well, Arieh, listen, I want to thank you for joining me today. Again, everybody, you can find his Substack, The Hat Tip. I encourage you to sign up. And everybody else, this is just the beginning of our January 6th programming. We have a lot more to come. We have some terrific guests on The Breakdown. We're speaking in the podcast this week. As always, I want to thank B and the whole crew, and everyone. We'll see you on Friday.